The year was 1879. The Dakota Territory stretched vast and unforgiving beneath an endless sky. For most settlers, the promise of land came with a price few could truly understand until they'd weathered their first winter. But for Eleanor Blackwood, daughter of wealthy cattle rancher Thomas Blackwood, life had always been comfortable until the day her father's debts caught up with him and she discovered her future had been wagered in a high-stakes poker game. What Eleanor didn't know was that a Lakota warrior named Cedar Wolf had infiltrated that very game with a purpose that went far beyond gambling. Their paths would cross in the most unexpected way, forever altering the course of both their lives and challenging the deepest prejudices of the American frontier. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across 5,000 acres of prime Dakota Territory, its rolling hills dotted with some of the finest cattle in the region. From the wide porch of the main house, 20-year-old Eleanor Blackwood could see clear to the horizon, where the land seemed to touch the sky in a seamless blend of earth and heaven. She'd grown up believing this view would be hers forever. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter against the autumn chill as she watched her father ride out with his foreman, Jackson Reed. Something wasn't right. Her father had been acting strangely for weeks, drinking more heavily, disappearing for days at a time, returning with bloodshot eyes and trembling hands. The ranch hands whispered when they thought she couldn't hear, but Eleanor had always had sharp ears. Miss Eleanor? Martha, their housekeeper since Eleanor was a child, appeared at her side. "There's a letter come for your father. Messenger said it was urgent." Eleanor took the envelope, noting the official seal of the First National Bank of Deadwood. Her stomach tightened. "Thank you, Martha. I'll see that he gets it." After Martha had gone, Eleanor turned the envelope over in her hands. Her father had forbidden her from involving herself in ranch business, insisting it was men's work. But the ranch was as much her home as his, and lately she'd begun to suspect he was keeping dangerous secrets. With a quick glance to ensure she was alone, Eleanor carefully opened the envelope. Final notice of foreclosure. Payment of $12,000. Due in full by November 1st, 1879. The paper trembled in her hands. $12,000, an impossible sum. The date was barely 2 weeks away. Eleanor's mind raced. The cattle drive earlier that year had been successful. They'd sold nearly 300 head at top dollar. Where had that money gone? She thought of her father's increasingly frequent trips to Deadwood, the new gambling hall that had opened there last spring. The sound of hoofbeats cut through her thoughts. Eleanor quickly resealed the envelope and tucked it into her pocket as her father and Jackson rode into the yard. Thomas Blackwood was once a powerful man, broad-shouldered and tall, with a commanding presence that made men step aside when he entered a room. But the man who dismounted now moved like someone twice his 50 years, his shoulders stooped, his once proud face lined and grey. "Eleanor," he said, removing his hat, "what are you doing out here in the cold?" "Waiting for you." "Father," she forced a smile, "a letter came. The messenger said it was urgent." Thomas's face darkened. He reached for the envelope, his hand unsteady. "Go inside, Eleanor. I have business to discuss with Jackson." "Father, if there's something wrong with the ranch—" "I said go inside." His voice cracked like a whip, causing Eleanor to flinch. She retreated to the house, but instead of going to her room, she positioned herself near the study window, which Thomas had left cracked open to release the pipe smoke that Martha complained fouled the curtains. "It's over, Jackson." Her father's voice drifted out. "The bank won't extend the loan. Williams says he's done carrying me." "What about the cattle we're holding for spring?" Jackson asked. "We could sell early, take a loss, but won't cover half what we owe." Thomas's voice was hollow. "I've borrowed against everything. The land, the house, the herd. Eleanor's heart pounded so loudly she feared they might hear it. "There's one play left," Thomas continued. "Davidson's high-stakes game tomorrow night in Deadwood. Buy-in is 500. Mr. Blackwood, you can't possibly think I've got a plan. Davidson's sweet on Eleanor. Has been since he saw her at the Founders' Day celebration. Offered me 5,000 for her hand last spring." Eleanor clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle her gasp. William Davidson was the owner of the largest silver mine in the territory, and nearly 60 years old, with a reputation for cruelty toward his workers. "Sir, you can't be suggesting—" Jackson's voice was horrified. "I'll put her up as collateral, just for show, to get Davidson to stake me. Once I win, I'll pay off the bank and no one need ever know." "And if you lose?" A long silence followed. "Then Davidson gets what he's wanted, all along." Eleanor backed away from the window, her legs threatening to give way beneath her. Her own father, gambling her away like she was no more than another piece of property. She fled to her room, mind spinning. She needed to leave, to run, but where? The nearest town was 20 miles away. She had no money of her own, no relatives she could turn to. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 12, and Thomas had never allowed her to form connections beyond the ranch. As night fell, Eleanor made her decision. She would confront her father, appeal to whatever shred of decency remained in him. She couldn't believe he would truly trade her life for his debts, but when she went downstairs, she found Thomas passed out in his study, an empty whiskey bottle on the floor beside him. Attempts to wake him proved futile. By morning, he was gone, leaving only a note saying he had business in Deadwood and would return in 2 days. The letter from the bank lay discarded on his desk, alongside a document that made Eleanor's blood run cold, a contract already bearing her father's signature, agreeing to the transfer of his daughter Eleanor Grace Blackwood in matrimony to William Davidson in exchange for settlement of all outstanding debts. Legal or not, the document represented her father's intent. He had already decided her fate. Eleanor paced her room all day, alternating between rage and despair. By evening, she had formed a desperate plan of her own. "Jackson," she called, finding the foreman in the stables. "I need your help." Jackson Reed had worked for the Blackwoods since before Eleanor was born. He'd taught her to ride, defended her when Thomas's temper flared, and quietly ensured she learned to shoot and defend herself, despite her father's objections that such skills weren't ladylike. "Miss Eleanor, I can't begin to tell you how sorry I'm about your father's planning." Jackson's weathered face was creased with concern. "I tried to talk him out of it, but I know Jackson, and I'm going to Deadwood to stop him." "That's too dangerous. Deadwood's no place for a young woman. Alone." "Then come with me," Eleanor said. "Help me save the ranch and myself from my father's foolishness." Jackson looked torn. "Your father fired me this morning, said he couldn't afford to pay me anymore." "All the more reason to help me," Eleanor pressed. "If I can stop him from gambling away everything, maybe we can find another way to save the ranch, a way that doesn't involve selling me to Davidson." After a long moment, Jackson nodded. "We'll leave at first light. Davidson's game doesn't start until tomorrow evening." "No," Eleanor said firmly. "We leave now. I need to see what my father's doing, who he's talking to. I need to understand what we're facing." 3 hours later, Eleanor and Jackson rode into Deadwood. The mining town had sprung up virtually overnight after gold was discovered in the Black Hills just 4 years earlier. Despite recent efforts to civilize it, Deadwood remained a rough place where fortunes were made and lost daily, and where the law often looked the other way for the right price. Eleanor had exchanged her dress for a pair of old trousers and one of Jackson's shirts, her hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. From a distance, she might pass for a young man, or at least, she hoped, not immediately draw the attention that a young woman alone would attract. They stabled their horses at the livery and made their way toward the Golden Palace, the gambling hall where Davidson hosted his exclusive high-stakes games. The streets were crowded with miners fresh off shift, cowboys looking for entertainment, and the various entrepreneurs who catered to them. "Wait here," Jackson said, stopping at the alley beside the Golden Palace. "Let me scout first." Eleanor nodded, pressing herself into the shadows. Jackson disappeared through the swinging doors, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the raucous sounds of piano music and drunken laughter. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour before Jackson returned, his expression grim. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "Your father's inside, at Davidson's private table in the back. They're not playing yet. Seems like they're waiting for the rest of the players, but Davidson has your father's marker, and they're talking about you." Eleanor felt sick. "Did you see the contract?" "No, but Davidson was telling the barkeep to prepare the private dining room upstairs for tomorrow night. Said he'd be celebrating his engagement." "We have to stop them," Eleanor said, starting forward. Jackson caught her arm. "There's something else. There's a Lakota man inside. Calls himself John Cedar, but I heard someone call him Cedar Wolf when they thought no one was listening. He's dressed like a white man, but he's definitely Lakota. And he's watching your father and Davidson very carefully." "A Lakota? What would he be doing in Deadwood?" Relations between the Lakota and the settlers had been strained for years, especially since the discovery of gold in their sacred Black Hills and the defeat of General Custer 3 years earlier at Little Bighorn. "I don't know, but he's carrying a lot of money, and he's gotten himself invited to Davidson's game tomorrow. I don't like it. Feels like there's more going on here than just your father's debts." Eleanor considered this new information. "Could he be dangerous?" "Any man with that much purpose is dangerous," Jackson said. "But who he's dangerous to, that I can't say." They found a small room at a boarding house several blocks from the Golden Palace, where the landlady was too interested in Jackson's money to question why a young man and his older companion needed lodging for the night. In the cramped room, Eleanor paced while Jackson cleaned his revolver. "We need to figure out what's happening at that poker game," she said. "If my father's truly intending to use me as collateral, we need to stop him before he can make the offer." "Davidson's games are invitation only," Jackson reminded her. "And they're guarded. We can't just walk in." Eleanor stopped pacing. "No, but I might be able to. Davidson wants me as his bride. What if I showed up, created a distraction?" "That's too risky," Jackson objected. "Once Davidson has you in his sights, he won't let you go easily." "Do you have a better idea?" Eleanor challenged. "Because come tomorrow night, I'll either be Davidson's unwilling fiancé, or my father will have lost everything, including me, in that game." Jackson had no answer. "Tell me about this Lakota," Eleanor said after a moment. "Cedar Wolf, what was he like?" "Hard to read. Carried himself like a warrior, but spoke perfect English. Seemed educated, and he was watching Davidson with a look I've seen before in hunters tracking dangerous prey." "What would a Lakota warrior want with Davidson?" Jackson shrugged. "The mine owners made plenty of enemies. Cheated prospectors out of claims, hired gunmen to run off small operators who wouldn't sell to him, and there are rumors he's been encroaching on Lakota land to the north, looking for new silver deposits." Eleanor sat on the edge of the narrow bed. Maybe this Cedar Wolf could be an ally, or he could be planning to kill Davidson, which would create a whole different problem for us, Jackson pointed out. "The law doesn't look kindly on Indians in these parts, especially ones who harm white men, no matter how deserving." Eleanor fell silent, weighing their limited options. Finally, she said, "Tomorrow morning, I want you to find out everything you can about Davidson, his routine, his weaknesses, anything we can use. I'll see what I can learn about this Cedar Wolf and why he's here. Maybe between the two of them, we can find a way out of this mess." Dawn broke cold and grey over Deadwood. Eleanor, still disguised as a young man, made her way to a small cafe, where Jackson had overheard Cedar Wolf mention he took his breakfast. She spotted him immediately, a tall man seated alone by the window, dressed in a well-tailored black suit that couldn't quite disguise the powerful build beneath. His hair was cut short in the white man's style, but his features were unmistakably Lakota, high cheekbones, copper skin, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As if sensing her scrutiny, those eyes suddenly lifted to meet hers. Eleanor froze, certain he could see through her disguise. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the room. Then, to her surprise, he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement and gestured to the empty chair across from him. Heart pounding, Eleanor made her way to his table. Up close, she could see the faint scars on his face, evidence of battles, fought and survived. His hands, resting lightly on the table, were those of a warrior, not a gambler. "You are Thomas Blackwood's daughter," he said softly, his voice deep and smooth. "Eleanor?" It wasn't a question. Eleanor glanced around nervously, but no one was paying them any attention. "How did you know?" she whispered. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "Your disguise might fool white men who see only what they expect to see, but my people learn to observe what is truly there, not what appears to be. Why are you in Deadwood, Mr. Cedar?" Eleanor asked, deliberately using the name he had given others. "Cedar Wolf," he corrected. "Among my people, I am Cedar. Wolf, here I am, whoever I need to be." He studied her face. "The real question is why Thomas Blackwood's daughter is in Deadwood, dressed as a boy, watching her father lose what remains of his honor." Eleanor's surprise must have shown on her face, for Cedar Wolf continued, "Yes, I know about your father's debts, and about Davidson's interest in you. How could you possibly—" "Because William Davidson took something from me as well," Cedar Wolf said, his expression hardening. "Something far more precious than money or land, and I have come to settle that debt one way or another." Eleanor realized she was sitting across from a man on a mission of vengeance, a mission that somehow intersected with her own desperate situation. "What did he take from you?" she asked quietly. Cedar Wolf's gaze grew distant. "My sister. Her name was Morning Star." The implications of his statement hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "Davidson has many appetites," Cedar Wolf continued, his voice controlled but with an underlying current of rage. 3 years ago, he visited our reservation with government officials, claiming to survey land for a new treaty. He saw Morning Star, who was just 16. 2 nights later, she disappeared. We searched for months before learning she had been taken to Davidson's private residence outside Deadwood. "Did you find her?" Eleanor asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "I found where she had been kept. I found witnesses who told me what he had done to her. And I found her grave, unmarked on Davidson's property, as if she were nothing." His hands had clenched into fists. "The local sheriff was in Davidson's pocket. The Indian agent wouldn't help, so I decided to seek justice in my own way." "The poker game," Eleanor said, understanding dawning. "You're going to ruin him." Cedar Wolf nodded. "I've spent 2 years learning his business, his weaknesses, his vices. I've earned and saved every penny I could to buy into his game. And tomorrow night I will take everything from him, his money, his pride, and then I will reveal who I am and why I've come." "He'll kill you," Eleanor said. "Perhaps, but he will know why he is being punished before he does." Cedar Wolf's eyes met hers again. "And now you know why your father's plan to offer you as collateral cannot be allowed to proceed. Davidson has broken one innocent woman already. I will not stand by and watch him claim another." Eleanor felt a strange mix of fear and hope. This man was dangerous, certainly, but perhaps he was exactly the ally she needed. "What if we helped each other?" she suggested. My father owes the bank $12,000. If he can't pay by the 1st of November, we lose everything. That's why he's desperate enough to use me as a bargaining chip with Davidson. And what would you have me do? Cedar Wolf asked. Help me stop my father from making this terrible mistake, Eleanor said. Help me find another way to save our ranch, and in return, I'll help you get close to Davidson without raising suspicion. Cedar Wolf considered her offer. How? Eleanor leaned forward. Davidson wants me. If I approached him directly, not as a hostage offered by my desperate father, but as a willing prospect, I could distract him, learn more about his plans, perhaps even find evidence of what he did to your sister that could be taken to federal authorities. Cedar Wolf studied Eleanor for a long moment, weighing her proposition. What you suggest is dangerous. Davidson is not a man who reacts well to being manipulated. I'm already in danger, Eleanor replied. At least this way, I have some control over what happens. A ghost of a smile touched Cedar Wolf's lips. You have your mother's spirit. Eleanor stared at him in shock. You knew my mother. Sarah Blackwood traded with our people before the troubles began. She treated us fairly when few others did. His expression softened slightly. She spoke often of her daughter, a girl with fire in her soul. The unexpected connection momentarily left Eleanor speechless. Her mother had died of fever 8 years ago, and her father rarely spoke of her. To hear her mentioned now by this stranger, who somehow wasn't entirely a stranger, brought a sudden ache to her chest. If we do this, Cedar Wolf continued, we need a better plan than just you approaching Davidson. He's suspicious by nature, and he'll question why Thomas Blackwood's daughter suddenly appears in Deadwood, especially if he already has an arrangement with your father. What do you suggest? We need leverage, something Davidson wants more than he wants you. Eleanor thought for a moment. The Silver Queen mine. It's his biggest holding, but I've heard rumors he's having trouble with it. The main shaft flooded last spring, and production has been down. Cedar Wolf nodded. Yes, but he's found a new vein in Lakota territory. That's why he was on our reservation 3 years ago. He discovered silver there and has been secretly mining it using the old workings as cover. That's illegal, Eleanor said. The Black Hills Treaty has been broken repeatedly by men like Davidson, Cedar Wolf finished. But if we had proof, documents, maps showing where he's really getting his silver, he'd do anything to keep that quiet, Eleanor realized. The government might not care about one Lakota girl, but they would care about treaty violations that could reignite conflict with the Sioux Nation. Precisely. Cedar Wolf leaned forward. Davidson keeps a safe in his office above the gambling hall. I've been watching him for weeks, but I haven't found a way to get access. But I might be able to, Eleanor said, her mind racing. If I approached, him expressed interest in his attention, he might be eager to impress me with his business acumen. A dangerous gamble, Cedar Wolf warned. No more dangerous than what you're planning, Eleanor countered. And with both of us working together, we have a better chance of success and survival than either of us does alone. After a moment, Cedar Wolf nodded. Very well. We will work together. But we must move quickly. The game is tonight, and if your father speaks to Davidson before we act, it could complicate matters. They spent the next hour developing their plan. Cedar Wolf would continue as planned with the poker game, while Eleanor would approach Davidson before it began, using her feminine wiles to gain access to his private rooms and hopefully his safe. What about Jackson? Eleanor asked. He'll want to help. The foreman I saw you with, best he remains unaware of our full plan. The fewer who know, the safer we all are. Tell him you found another way, but give him no details. Eleanor wasn't comfortable keeping Jackson in the dark, but she understood the logic. And what about my father? He doesn't deserve to lose everything because of his foolishness. Cedar Wolf's expression hardened. Your father was willing to sacrifice his own daughter to pay his debts. Such a man has already lost everything of true value. Eleanor couldn't argue with that bitter truth. Nevertheless, he's still my father. If we can find a way to pay the bank without ruining him completely, we will see what the night brings, Cedar Wolf said, non-committal. For now, we focus on Davidson. They parted with an agreement to meet again that afternoon. Eleanor found Jackson waiting anxiously at their boarding house. "Where have you been?" he demanded. "I've been worried sick. This town is no place for—" "I know where I've been, Jackson." Eleanor cut him off. "And I've found a way to stop Davidson." She explained that she had met Cedar Wolf and learned he had his own grievance against Davidson, carefully omitting the details of Morningstar's fate and their plan to access the mine owner's safe. "I don't like it," Jackson said when she finished. "Trusting an Indian with something this important. Cedar Wolf has more reason to hate Davidson than anyone," Eleanor said firmly, "and he's agreed to help me get proof of wrongdoing that will force Davidson to back off from both me and the ranch." Jackson still looked skeptical, but nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep an eye on my father. Make sure he doesn't do anything rash before tonight, and be ready to ride at a moment's notice if things go wrong." The afternoon passed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor abandoned her disguise, using their remaining money to purchase a suitable dress from a seamstress who raised her eyebrows but asked no questions when presented with enough cash. The gown was deep burgundy with black lace trim, more sophisticated than anything Eleanor would normally wear, and revealing enough to draw a man's attention without crossing into indecency. She arranged her honey blonde hair in a style she'd seen on wealthy women who occasionally visited the ranch, hoping it made her look older than her 20 years. When she met Cedar Wolf at the agreed location, a small church at the edge of town, his eyes widened briefly before his expression returned to its usual controlled mask. "You look like a different person," he observed. "That's the idea," Eleanor replied, fighting unexpected nervousness. "Will it work?" "Davidson will not be able to resist," Cedar Wolf confirmed. "But remember, his interest in you goes beyond mere attraction. You represent something he desires: legitimacy, respectability, connection to the old ranching families of the territory." "I understand." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I know what to do." Cedar Wolf handed her a small folded paper. "Memorize this. It's the combination to Davidson's safe, as best I've been able to determine from watching him. I cannot be certain it's correct, but it's our best chance." Eleanor studied the numbers, then tucked the paper into her bodice. "If I'm not back in the main hall by 8 o'clock, I will find you," Cedar Wolf promised, his dark eyes intense. "Davidson will not harm another woman while I draw breath." The conviction in his voice steadied her nerves, for reasons she couldn't fully explain. Eleanor trusted this man she'd known less than a day more than she trusted most people she'd known all her life. "Good luck tonight," she said, "and thank you." Cedar Wolf simply nodded, but his expression softened momentarily. Then he was gone, slipping away to make his own preparations for the evening. The Golden Palace was already crowded when Eleanor arrived at 6 o'clock. She ignored the stares and whispers that followed her through the main gambling hall, focusing instead on the ornate staircase at the rear that led to Davidson's private rooms. A burly guard blocked her path at the bottom of the stairs. "Private area, miss. No admittance." Eleanor summoned her most charming smile. "Please inform Mr. Davidson that Eleanor Blackwood would like a word with him. I believe he'll want to see me." The guard's eyes widened in recognition of her name. He hesitated, then nodded and ascended the stairs. Minutes later, he returned. "Mr. Davidson will see you now, Miss Blackwood." Heart-pounding, Eleanor climbed the stairs to meet the man who had tormented her dreams since her father had first mentioned his offer months ago. William Davidson's private office was exactly what she'd expected. ostentatious, designed to impress and intimidate. Heavy furniture, expensive carpets, walls lined with books she suspected he'd never read. The man himself rose from behind a massive desk as she entered. Davidson was tall and broad-shouldered, with the build of someone who had once done physical labor, but now enjoyed too much rich food and whiskey. His hair and beard were steel gray, impeccably groomed, and his suit was clearly tailored in Denver, or perhaps even Chicago. His eyes, cold blue and calculating, assessed her as if she were a prize heifer at auction. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice surprisingly cultured for a man rumored to have begun his fortune as a common miner. "This is an unexpected pleasure. I was under the impression I would be seeing your father this evening." Eleanor forced herself to smile, though her skin crawled under his gaze. "Mr. Davidson, I hope you'll forgive my boldness in coming to see you directly." "Boldness in a beautiful woman is never something to forgive," Davidson replied smoothly, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit, whiskey." "No, thank you." Eleanor perched on the edge of the chair, maintaining perfect posture as Martha had taught her. "I prefer clarity when discussing business." Davidson's eyebrow rose as he took his own seat. "Business? I wasn't aware we had business to discuss, Miss Blackwood." "Perhaps not officially," Eleanor said, meeting his gaze directly. "But I've heard rumors, Mr. Davidson, about arrangements being made regarding my future without my consultation." Davidson had the grace to look momentarily discomfited. "Your father and I have had conversations, but nothing has been finalized." "I see." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "And did my father mention that I might have my own opinions on such matters?" "He suggested you were a dutiful daughter who understood the realities of territorial life," Davidson said carefully. Eleanor laughed softly. "My father has never understood me, Mr. Davidson, which is why I've come to speak with you directly. If arrangements are being made for my future, I prefer to negotiate my own terms." Interest flared in Davidson's cold eyes. "How progressive of you, Miss Blackwood. And what terms did you have in mind?" "First, I'd like to understand exactly what I would be agreeing to," Eleanor said. "Marriage, I presume, or something less formal." "I am a traditional man, Miss Blackwood. Marriage would be the only arrangement I would consider with a woman of your standing. And what would such a marriage entail? Would I be expected to remain here in Deadwood, or would we live at the ranch?" Davidson smiled, revealing teeth too perfect to be natural. "I have a home outside town, far more comfortable than your father's ranch house. You would want for nothing, except perhaps freedom," Eleanor said lightly. "I've grown accustomed to certain liberties at the ranch, riding alone, managing the household, making decisions." "A wife has different responsibilities," Davidson replied, his smile tightening slightly. "But you would find I can be generous to those who please me." Eleanor suppressed a shudder at the implication. "And my father's debts? I understand they're substantial." "They would be forgiven naturally. Your father could continue operating the ranch, though, of course, as your husband, I would have certain rights to the property." Just as she'd suspected, this wasn't just about her. Davidson wanted the Blackwood Ranch, likely for the water rights that came with it. "Essential for mining operations. I'd like to know more about the man whose name I might take," Eleanor said, rising from her chair and moving to examine the paintings on the wall, working her way casually toward the corner where she suspected the safe might be hidden. "Your business interests, for instance. The Silver Queen mine, I hear it's been having difficulties." Davidson's eyes narrowed slightly. "Nothing serious. Production always fluctuates in mining. We've recently opened some promising new workings." "How fascinating," Eleanor said, moving to another wall where a large painting of a mountain landscape hung. "If Cedar Wolf's information was correct, the safe would be behind it. My father always said mining was a riskier venture than ranching, but clearly more profitable. When managed correctly," Davidson agreed, watching her movements with growing suspicion. Miss Blackwood, perhaps we should return to the matter at hand." "Of course," Eleanor said, turning back to him with an apologetic smile. "Forgive my curiosity. A potential wife should take interest in her husband's affairs, should she not?" Davidson's expression softened slightly. "Indeed, and I find your directness refreshing, if unexpected." "Then you won't mind if I'm direct about something else," Eleanor said, returning to stand before his desk. "I have no intention of being traded like cattle to settle my father's debts." Davidson's face hardened. "Then why are you here?" "To propose an alternative," Eleanor said calmly, though her heart raced. "One that might benefit us both. I understand you've been expanding your mining operations northward." The change in Davidson was immediate and alarming. His eyes went cold, his posture stiffening. "What do you know about my operations?" "Only rumors," Eleanor said quickly, "but enough to understand that discretion might be valuable to you, perhaps more valuable than acquiring a reluctant bride or even my father's water rights." Davidson rose slowly from his chair, his size suddenly intimidating as he loomed over her. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Blackwood." "Not a game. Mr. Davidson, a negotiation." Eleanor forced herself to stand her ground. "My father's debts are cleared, and in return you receive my silence regarding certain northern ventures." Davidson moved around the desk, and Eleanor had to resist the urge to back away. "And how would a rancher's daughter come by such information? Who have you been talking to?" "Does it matter?" Eleanor countered. "What matters is whether we can reach an agreement that benefits us both without the complication of an unwanted marriage." Davidson studied her for a long moment, then smiled, a predatory expression that sent ice down her spine. "You are even more interesting than I anticipated, Miss Blackwood, but I think you overestimate your position." He moved to the door and locked it, pocketing the key. "You've come alone to the private rooms of a man your father warns you against, making vague accusations about business matters you couldn't possibly understand. How do you imagine this ends?" Fear bloomed in Eleanor's chest, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "I imagine it ends with a mutually beneficial arrangement, Mr. Davidson, unless you prefer the complications that would arise from harming Thomas Blackwood's daughter." Davidson laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Complications can be managed, Miss Blackwood, just as other complications have been managed in the past." The threat hung in the air between them. Eleanor thought of Morning Star, Cedar Wolf's sister, and felt sick. "Now," Davidson continued, moving toward her with deliberate slowness, "I think it's time we discuss the real terms of our arrangement." Eleanor backed away, her mind racing. She hadn't anticipated being locked in with him, had expected to be able to search his office while he prepared for the poker game. The safe was just behind that painting, tantalizingly close, but now potentially out of reach. "My father is expecting me," she said, trying to keep her voice level. "As is Mr. Cedar, whom I met on the journey here. They'll look for me if I don't. Return soon." The name triggered a reaction, subtle but unmistakable. Davidson paused. "Cedar? John Cedar?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed, sensing an advantage. "He's been most attentive since my arrival in Deadwood. A perfect gentleman." Davidson's eyes narrowed. "Stay away from that man, Miss Blackwood. He's not what he appears to be." "Few people are," Eleanor replied, "myself included." Before Davidson could respond, a sharp knock came at the door. "Mr. Davidson, the gentlemen are arriving for the game, sir." Davidson hesitated, clearly torn between dealing with Eleanor and attending to his guests. "Business won out. We'll continue this discussion later," he said, moving to unlock the door. "Roberts, escort Miss Blackwood downstairs and keep an eye on her. She's not going to leave the building." The guard who had initially brought her upstairs appeared, looking surprised but nodding in acknowledgement. "And Roberts," Davidson added in a lower voice that Eleanor barely caught. "Find out what you can about John Cedar, discreetly." As Eleanor was led back to the main floor, her mind worked frantically. She had failed to access the safe, and now Davidson was suspicious of Cedar Wolf. She had made things worse, not better. The gambling hall was even more crowded now, filled with miners and cowboys spending their hard-earned money. At a table near the back, Eleanor spotted her father, already deep in his cups, conversing with a group of well-dressed men she didn't recognize. Of Cedar Wolf there was no sign. Roberts deposited her at a small table near the bar. "Wait here," he instructed curtly. Eleanor nodded meekly, playing the cowed young woman, but as soon as Roberts moved away to speak to the barkeep, she slipped from her seat and made her way through the crowd toward the rear exit. If she could just get outside, find Cedar Wolf or Jackson. She had nearly reached the door when a hand closed around her arm. Eleanor turned, expecting Roberts, but instead found herself looking into Cedar Wolf's dark eyes. "What happened?" he asked quietly, steering her toward a shadowed alcove where they could speak without being overheard. Quickly, Eleanor explained her failed attempt to access the safe and Davidson's suspicious reaction to Cedar Wolf's name. "He knows, Cedar," Wolf said grimly, "or at least he suspects. We must move quickly. But how? He's locked the office, and now he's watching for both of us." Cedar Wolf's expression was resolute. "There is another way. During the game, most of Davidson's men will be focused on providing security for the players and their money. The upstairs will be less guarded, but the office will still be locked." A ghost of a smile touched Cedar Wolf's lips as he produced a small metal tool from his pocket. "The white man's locks are not as secure as he believes." Eleanor looked at him with newfound respect. "You've been planning this for a long time." 3 years, Cedar Wolf confirmed, "but now we must act within hours." He glanced across the room to where Davidson was greeting his arriving guests for the high-stakes game. "The game will begin soon. Your father is already here." Eleanor followed his gaze and saw Thomas Blackwood take a seat at Davidson's table. Even from a distance, she could see the desperation in his face, the tremor in his hands as he placed a stack of bills before him, his buy-in for the game that would determine her fate. "What do we do?" she asked. "You create a distraction," Cedar Wolf said. "Something to draw attention away from the stairs. I'll handle the rest." "What kind of distraction?" Cedar Wolf considered for a moment. "Something dramatic, but not suspicious. Perhaps a scorned woman confronting her lover." Understanding dawned on Eleanor. "You want me to publicly confront my father?" Cedar Wolf nodded. "It would be expected, given what he plans to do. And it would draw all eyes to you, away from me." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I can do that." Eleanor felt her hands trembling slightly as she prepared herself. Creating a distraction meant becoming the center of attention, something she normally avoided, but now lives depended on it. "Once you begin," Cedar Wolf instructed quietly, "don't look for me. Focus only on your father and Davidson. Make it convincing." Eleanor nodded. "How much time do you need?" 10 minutes at least. More, if possible. I'll give you as much as I can." She straightened her shoulders. "Be careful." Cedar Wolf's expression softened momentarily. "You as well, Eleanor Blackwood." With that, he melted into the crowd, moving toward the rear of the gambling hall where the staircase led to Davidson's office. Eleanor watched him go, then turned her attention to the poker table where her father and Davidson were now seated with 4 other men. Wealthy ranchers and businessmen from around the territory, all prepared to risk thousands on the turn of a card. Eleanor took a deep breath, then strode purposefully toward the table, her burgundy dress drawing eyes as she moved through the crowd. She stopped directly behind her father's chair. "Hello, father," she said, her voice carrying clearly. Over the general noise of the gambling hall, Thomas Blackwood froze, then turned slowly, his bloodshot eyes widening in shock. "Eleanor, what in God's name are you doing here?" The other players looked up with interest. Davidson's expression darkened dangerously. "I've come to stop you from making the biggest mistake of your life," Eleanor said, loud enough for surrounding tables to hear. Conversations began to die away as people turned to watch the unfolding drama. "This is neither the time nor the place," Thomas hissed, rising from his chair. "Go back to the ranch immediately." "The ranch that you're gambling away?" Eleanor challenged. "Or perhaps I should say, the daughter you're gambling away." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Thomas blanched. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said weakly. "Don't I?" Eleanor pulled the contract from her pocket, the one she'd found in her father's study bearing his signature. She held it up for all to see. "This says otherwise, father. A contract signing me over to Mr. Davidson like a piece of property." The murmur became a buzz of shocked conversation. Thomas Blackwood looked around wildly, as if seeking escape. Davidson rose to his feet, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "you are causing a scene in my establishment." "Better a scene now than a tragedy later," Eleanor retorted. She turned to address the crowd that had now gathered around them. "Ladies and gentlemen, my father owes the bank $12,000. Rather than face his failure like a man, he has arranged to sell me, his only daughter, to Mr. Davidson to settle his debts." Gasps and mutters of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Even in Deadwood, there were standards. Women might be scarce, and marriages of convenience common, but selling one's daughter crossed a line. Davidson moved quickly to control the situation. "Miss Blackwood is distraught and confused. There is no such arrangement." "Then why is your signature on this document?" Eleanor challenged, thrusting the contract toward him. Davidson ignored the paper. "This is a private matter that should be discussed privately. Roberts!" The guard appeared instantly at his employer's side. "Escort Miss Blackwood and her father to my private dining room. We will resolve this matter civilly, away from prying eyes." Eleanor saw her chance to buy Cedarwolf more time. "I will not be silenced or hidden away," she declared dramatically. "Everyone should know what kind of man William Davidson truly is." The crowd was fully engaged now, watching the unfolding drama with avid interest. Out of the corner of her eye, Eleanor saw Cedarwolf slip up the staircase, unnoticed in the commotion. "He preys on desperate men and vulnerable women," she continued, her voice rising. "He takes what doesn't belong to him, whether it's land, silver, or people." Davidson's face had turned an alarming shade of red. "That's enough," he snapped, nodding to Roberts and another guard who moved toward Eleanor. Thomas Blackwood, shockingly, stepped between them and his daughter. "Don't touch her," he said, his voice steadier than Eleanor had heard it in months. "Control your daughter." "Blackwood," Davidson warned, "or I'll withdraw my offer to settle your debts." "There is no offer," Thomas said, and Eleanor heard something in his voice she hadn't heard since her mother died. Resolve. "Just an old man's cowardice. Eleanor's right. I've behaved shamefully." For a moment, Eleanor was too stunned to continue. Her planned theatrics. Her father met her gaze, and she saw genuine remorse in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," he said quietly. "I forgot what your mother would expect of me, of us both." Davidson had clearly had enough. "This is all very touching, but we have a game to play. Gentlemen, shall we continue?" "I think not," said one of the other players, a silver-haired man Eleanor didn't recognize. "I don't gamble with men who traffic in women." "Nor I," agreed another, rising from the table. Davidson's carefully cultivated facade of respectability was crumbling before their eyes. Eleanor silently thanked the universe for the frontier's surprising moral code, flexible in many areas, but rigid in others. "This is absurd," Davidson sputtered. The girl is creating fiction to cause trouble. Blackwood, control your daughter or leave my establishment." Thomas straightened his shoulders. "We'll leave and take our business elsewhere." He turned to Eleanor. "Come, daughter, we have much to discuss. This wasn't part of the plan. Eleanor needed to create more chaos, buy more time." Cedar Wolf hadn't returned from upstairs yet. "Wait," she said, turning back to Davidson. "Before we go, I want everyone to know what really happened to Morning Star." The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Davidson went very still, his face suddenly bloodless. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Morning Star," Eleanor repeated. "The Lakota girl who disappeared from the reservation 3 years ago, the one whose unmarked grave lies on your property." Complete silence fell over the gambling hall. Even the piano player had stopped, sensing the tension in the air. "I don't know what you're talking about," Davidson said, but his eyes darted nervously around the room. "I think you do," came a new voice from the back of the crowd. The onlookers parted as Cedar Wolf strode forward, no longer dressed as a gambler, but in traditional Lakota attire, fringed buckskins with intricate beadwork, his long hair flowing free. In one hand, he held a stack of papers, in the other, a ceremonial knife. "Morning Star was my sister," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the now silent room. "She was 16 years old when William Davidson took her from our reservation. When she resisted his advances, he killed her and buried her body on his land." Davidson's hand moved toward his jacket, where Eleanor suspected he kept a pistol. "This man is deranged. Someone call the sheriff." "The sheriff won't help you this time," Cedar Wolf said calmly. "These papers," he held up the documents he'd taken from Davidson's safe, "prove that you've been illegally mining on Lakota land, in violation of the treaty. They also contain your personal journal, detailing your activities with several young women, including my sister." Davidson lunged for the documents, but Cedar Wolf stepped back smoothly, passing them to Eleanor. "Run," he whispered. "Find Jackson. Get these to the federal marshal in Rapid City." Eleanor clutched the papers, understanding instantly. Cedar Wolf had come here for justice, yes, but also revenge, and he intended to face Davidson alone. "No," she whispered back fiercely. "We do this together." Davidson had drawn his pistol now, pointing it directly at Cedar Wolf. "Give me those papers, or I'll kill you where you stand, Indian." The crowd scattered, diving for cover or fleeing toward the exits. Only Thomas Blackwood remained at Eleanor's side, placing himself partially in front of her despite the tremor. "In his hands. You've taken enough lives," Cedar Wolf said, his voice steady despite the gun aimed at his chest. "The spirits of your victims cry out for justice." "There'll be no justice for a dead Indian," Davidson sneered. "No one will believe your wild tales over the word of a respected businessman." "They might believe mine," came yet another voice. Sheriff Daniel McBride pushed through the remaining onlookers, his star glinting on his chest. Eleanor remembered Jackson mentioning that McBride was in Davidson's pocket, and her heart sank. "Sheriff," Davidson said, relief evident in his voice, "arrest this man. He's threatening me and spreading lies." McBride surveyed the scene with narrowed eyes. "Lower your weapon, Davidson. There'll be no shooting in my town without cause." Reluctantly, Davidson lowered his pistol, though he didn't holster it. "This Indian broke into my office. That's enough." "Maybe," McBride allowed. "But before we get to that, I'd like to know more about these papers he's talking about, and that grave he mentioned." Davidson's confidence faltered. "You can't possibly believe—" "What I believe," McBride interrupted, "is that there have been too many unexplained disappearances in this county these past few years. Too many young women who vanished without a trace." His gaze hardened. "Including my niece, who worked as a maid in your house last winter." Eleanor exchanged a startled glance with Cedar Wolf. It seemed Davidson's predations extended beyond Morning Star, and he'd made the mistake of targeting someone connected to local law. Enforcement. This is preposterous, Davidson blustered. Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man and return my property. In good time, McBride said. First, I think we'll take a ride out to your property and have a look around. Those papers too, miss, if you don't mind. Eleanor hesitated, unsure if the sheriff could be trusted. Cedar Wolf gave her an almost imperceptible nod, and she handed over the documents. McBride flipped through them, his expression darkening with each page. When he looked up, his eyes were cold as Dakota winter. William Davidson, you're under arrest on suspicion of murder, treaty violation, and a whole host of other charges I'll figure out once I've read through all this. This is outrageous. Davidson's face purpled with rage. You work for me, McBride. I own this town. Not anymore, McBride said flatly. He gestured to his deputies who had appeared behind him. Take him into custody, and be careful. He's armed and desperate. Davidson looked wildly around, seeking escape or allies. Finding neither, he made one last desperate play. With surprising speed for a man his size, he lunged forward, grabbing Eleanor and pressing his pistol to her temple. Back! Off, he shouted. All of you, or she dies right here. Eleanor froze, terror washing through her in an icy wave. Davidson's arm across her throat made it difficult to breathe, and she could feel the cold metal of the gun barrel against her skin. Let the girl go, Davidson, McBride said, his own weapon now drawn but unable to risk a shot with Eleanor as a shield. You're only making things worse for yourself. Shut up and listen, Davidson snarled. This is what's going to happen. I'm walking out of here with the girl. When I'm safely away, I'll release her. Try to stop me and she dies. The entire room had gone deathly still. Eleanor caught Cedar Wolf's gaze across the distance that separated them. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with intensity as he gave her the slightest of nods. Somehow she understood what he was asking of her. In one fluid motion, Eleanor went completely limp, dropping her full weight downward while twisting to the side. Davidson, caught off guard, struggled to maintain his grip. In that moment of distraction, Cedar Wolf moved with the fluid grace of a hunting cougar. The ceremonial knife flashed in the lamplight as he closed the distance between them in two long strides. Davidson screamed as the blade pierced his wrist, the pistol clattering to the floor. Eleanor broke free, stumbling forward into her father's arms as Cedar Wolf forced Davidson to his knees. For Morning Star, Cedar Wolf said softly, the knife now pressed against Davidson's throat, and for all the others. Don't do it, son, Sheriff McBride said, stepping forward cautiously. He'll face justice proper. I promise you that. For a long, tense moment, Eleanor thought Cedar Wolf would ignore the sheriff's words. The desire for vengeance was written clearly on his face, in the tension of his body, in the way the knife pressed just hard enough against Davidson's throat to draw a thin line of blood. Then, unexpectedly, Thomas Blackwood spoke. He's not worth your soul, young man. Trust me on that. Cedar Wolf's eyes flickered to Thomas, then to Eleanor. She held her breath. With a visible effort, Cedar Wolf stepped back, lowering the knife. You're right, he said quietly. My sister's spirit deserves better than the company of this man in the afterlife. Davidson sagged with relief as the deputies moved in to secure him. Sheriff McBride himself took charge of the documents Cedar Wolf had retrieved from the safe. These will be sent to the federal authorities, he explained. Along with Davidson, there'll be a proper trial. As Davidson was led away, still protesting his innocence and threatening retribution, Eleanor turned to her father. I'm sorry, Thomas said before she could speak. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know I see now what I've become. What I almost did to you. Eleanor studied the face of the man who had raised her, the lines of sorrow and regret now visible beneath, the ravages of alcohol and desperation. We still have to face the bank, she pointed out. The ranch is still in danger. Yes, Thomas admitted, but we'll face it together, the right way. And if we lose it, well, there are worse things than losing land, as I've learned today. Sheriff. McBride approached them, tipping his hat respectfully to Eleanor. Miss Blackwood, your bravery today helped bring a dangerous man to justice. The territory owes you a debt. It's Cedar Wolf who deserves your thanks, Eleanor replied. He's the one who gathered the evidence, who risked everything for justice. McBride nodded, turning to Cedar Wolf, who stood slightly apart, his expression guarded, as it often was, around white authority figures. The law doesn't always treat your people fairly, the sheriff acknowledged, but today you've helped the law work as it should. For that, you have my gratitude. Cedar Wolf accepted the words with a slight inclination of his head. Will the evidence be enough to convict him? With what we found in his safe and what we're likely to find on his property. Once we start digging, McBride's expression was grim. Yes, I believe it will be more than enough. What about our bank debt? Thomas asked hesitantly. I don't mean to seem ungrateful for your help, Sheriff, but we still owe $12,000 by the 1st of the month. McBride considered this. I can't help you there directly, Mr. Blackwood, but... He paused, thoughtful. Davidson's illegal mining operation on Lakota land has been generating considerable profit. By rights, that money belongs to the Lakota people as compensation. Cedar Wolf straightened, understanding dawning in his eyes. If such compensation were to be awarded, he said carefully, the tribal council would have authority over its distribution. Indeed, they would, McBride agreed. And I imagine they might look favorably on allocating a portion to those who helped bring Davidson's crimes to light. Eleanor looked between the two men, hope blooming cautiously in her chest. Is that possible? It would be unusual, Cedar Wolf acknowledged, but not without precedent. And I believe I could persuade the council, especially in light of your mother's history of fair trading with our people. Thomas Blackwood looked stunned. You would do that after what I tried to do? Cedar Wolf's expression remained serious. Not for you, he said bluntly, for your daughter, who showed courage where you showed cowardice, and for your wife's memory. Thomas nodded, accepting the rebuke without argument. Outside the Golden Palace, the night air was cool and clean after the smoky confines of the gambling hall. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling as if she were drawing her first real breath in. Oh, Days, what will you do now? She asked Cedar Wolf as they stood on the boardwalk, watching the sheriff's men secure Davidson in the jailhouse across the street. First, I will return to my people and report what has happened, he replied. Then I will honor my sister's memory by working to strengthen the enforcement of our treaty rights. Will I see you again? Eleanor asked, surprised by how much she hoped the answer would be yes. Cedar Wolf studied her face in the lamplight. The world is changing, Eleanor Blackwood. The old boundaries between our peoples are not what they once were. Perhaps there is a future where paths that have crossed continue to run parallel for a time. It wasn't a direct answer, but Eleanor understood the sentiment behind his careful words. In this time and place, relationships between their peoples were fraught with complexity and prejudice, yet something had formed between them, a bond of respect and understanding that transcended the usual barriers. I would like that, she said simply. From the shadows of a nearby alley, Jackson appeared, relief evident on his weathered face. Miss Eleanor, I've been looking everywhere for you. When the commotion started, I feared the worst. We're fine, Jackson, Eleanor assured him. Better than fine, actually. We have a way to save the ranch. As they began the journey back to Blackwood Ranch the next morning, Eleanor found herself riding beside Cedar Wolf for a time. Her father and Jackson rode ahead, giving them a measure of privacy. My sister would be pleased with how this ended, Cedar Wolf said, breaking a comfortable silence. Not with vengeance, but with justice. I think she would also be proud of her brother, Eleanor replied. You chose the harder path. Cedar Wolf smiled. the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "As did you. It would have been easier to run away. Some things are worth fighting for," Eleanor said, "even when the odds seem impossible." Cedar Wolf nodded in agreement, his eyes on the horizon where the sun was rising over the Dakota plains, painting the sky in shades of gold and promise. "Indeed they are, Eleanor Blackwood. Indeed they are." 3 months had passed since the events in Deadwood. The Dakota winter had arrived in earnest, blanketing the Blackwood ranch in pristine white. Eleanor stood on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands as she watched the sun rise over the eastern hills. The world looked different somehow, cleaner, full of possibility. The sound of an axe splitting wood rang through the crisp morning air. Eleanor smiled, knowing her father was at work in the woodshed. Thomas Blackwood had changed profoundly since that night at the Golden Palace. He'd stopped drinking entirely, rising each day before dawn to tackle the endless work of the ranch with renewed purpose. The haunted look had left his eyes, replaced by quiet determination. Their financial situation had been resolved more smoothly than Eleanor had dared hope. True to his word, Cedar Wolf had advocated before the Lakota Tribal Council, resulting in a settlement that covered the Blackwoods' bank debt, with some remaining to reinvest in the ranch. In return, Thomas had signed an agreement establishing fair water rights for the Lakota and guaranteeing safe passage across a section of Blackwood, land that had traditionally been part of tribal hunting grounds. William Davidson's fate had been swift and severe. The evidence from his safe, combined with what was discovered at his property, including the remains of 3 young women, had resulted in multiple convictions. He now faced the rest of his life in a federal prison, his empire dismantled, his ill-gotten wealth redistributed to his victims' families and the communities he had harmed. Movement at the edge of the property caught Eleanor's attention. A lone rider approached from the north, following the winding path that led from the main road to the ranch house. Even at a distance, Eleanor recognized the straight-backed posture and fluid movement of Cedar Wolf. Her heart quickened. She hadn't seen him since the tribal council meeting 6 weeks ago, though his presence had remained with her in many ways, in the changes to the ranch operations, in her father's gradual reconciliation with their Lakota neighbors, in her own dreams of a future different from anything she'd imagined before. Eleanor set down her coffee cup and pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders as she descended the porch steps to greet him. Cedar Wolf dismounted with characteristic grace, leading his paint horse the final distance. "Eleanor Blackwood," he said, his breath visible in the cold air. He was dressed for winter in a mixture of traditional Lakota and settler attire, buckskin leggings and a heavy wool coat with an intricately beaded necklace visible at his throat. "Cedar Wolf," she replied, unable to suppress her smile. "This is a surprise." "A good one, I hope." There was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there when they first met. "The best kind," Eleanor assured him. "Come inside. It's freezing out." "Here?" Cedar Wolf tethered his horse to the hitching post and followed her into the warmth of the ranch house. Martha appeared from the kitchen, nodding respectfully to their visitor. "I'll bring more coffee," she said, disappearing before Eleanor could respond. In the sitting room, a fire blazed in the hearth, casting dancing light across the familiar furnishings. Eleanor gestured Cedar Wolf to a chair near the fire, taking the one opposite. "How is your father?" Cedar Wolf asked, removing his gloves. "Better every day," Eleanor replied. "He's working with Jackson to expand the north pasture. We're hoping to increase the herd by spring." Cedar Wolf nodded. "Good. And the agreement with my people? There have been no issues?" "None. In fact, 2 of the tribal hunters helped our men track a mountain lion that was preying on calves last month. They've been teaching us their methods." Martha returned with coffee and warm cornbread, setting the tray between them before retreating discreetly. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, warming themselves after the morning chill. "I've come with news," Cedar Wolf said finally, "and with a proposition." Eleanor raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What kind of news?" "The territorial governor has appointed a new Indian agent for our reservation, one not chosen by the mining interests for a change. A man named Charles Peterson from Boston. He arrived last week." "Is that good or bad?" "Potentially good. He seems genuinely interested in enforcing treaty rights and improving conditions." Cedar Wolf took a sip of coffee. "Which brings me to the proposition." Eleanor leaned forward slightly, curious. "Peterson is forming a council of advisors, both white and Lakota, to help bridge understanding between our peoples. He's asked me to suggest candidates who understand both worlds." Cedar Wolf met her gaze directly. "I recommended you." "Me?" Eleanor was genuinely surprised. "I hardly know anything about tribal governance or territorial politics." "You know more than you think," Cedar Wolf replied. "You understood immediately what Davidson was doing on our land. You risked your life to see justice done, not just for yourself, but for my sister and the others. You see people as they are, not as others tell you they are." Eleanor was touched by his assessment, but still uncertain. "What would this position entail exactly?" "Monthly meetings at the reservation and in Rapid City, reviewing proposed policies affecting relations between settlers and the Lakota, making recommendations on everything from trade regulations to educational initiatives." Cedar Wolf set down his cup. "It would be challenging work, sometimes frustrating, but important." Eleanor considered the idea. She'd never thought of herself as someone who could influence territorial politics. Ranch life was all she knew. But then again, 3 months ago, she'd never imagined confronting someone like Davidson or forging an alliance with a Lakota warrior. "What does my father think of this?" she asked. "I haven't spoken to him yet." "I wanted your thoughts first." The gesture wasn't lost on Eleanor. Cedar Wolf was treating her as an independent person, with her own decisions to make, not as someone whose fate should be discussed with the men in her life first. "I'm honored by your recommendation," she said, carefully. "But I need time to consider it." Cedar Wolf nodded. "Of course, Peterson won't finalize appointments until next month." The front door opened, bringing a blast of cold air as Thomas Blackwood stomped snow from his boots in the entryway. He appeared in the sitting room doorway, his expression registering surprise at their visitor. "Cedar Wolf," he said, coming forward with an outstretched hand. "Welcome." Eleanor watched with quiet amazement as the two men shook hands. The change in her father extended to this as well, a genuine respect for the man he might once have dismissed or feared. "I was just telling Eleanor about the new Indian agent," Cedar Wolf explained, "and his plans for an advisory council." Thomas nodded, taking a seat beside his daughter. "Peterson, I met him briefly in town last week. Seemed a decent sort, educated but not condescending about it." "He's offered a position on the council to Eleanor," Cedar Wolf said directly. Thomas's eyebrows rose. He looked at Eleanor, then back at Cedar Wolf. "Has he now?" Eleanor tensed, anticipating the old Thomas to emerge, the father who insisted women had no place in politics or business. Instead, he surprised her. "She'd be good at it," Thomas said thoughtfully. "Always could. See all sides of a problem, even as a child." Got that from her mother. The casual compliment warmed Eleanor more than the fire. "I haven't decided yet," she said. "Well, it's your choice," Thomas replied. "Ranch can spare you for meetings if that's what you want. Jackson and I have things well in hand here." Another surprise, not just permission, but encouragement. Eleanor realized her father truly had changed, or perhaps had rediscovered the man he'd been before grief and alcohol had twisted him. Their conversation shifted to ranch matters. The coming spring, plans for the herd, improvements to the irrigation. system that might benefit both Blackwood land and the neighboring tribal areas. Though none of them acknowledged it directly, there was a sense of new possibilities in the air, of old wounds beginning to heal, of bridges being built where once there had been only walls. As Cedar Wolf prepared to leave later that morning, Eleanor walked with him to where his horse was tethered. "There's something else," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Something personal." Eleanor looked up at him, noting the unusual hesitation in his normally confident manner. "What is it?" "The tribal council has granted me land of my own, at the junction of Bear Creek and Little Missouri. Good water, good grazing. Close enough to the reservation to maintain my ties there, but—" he paused. "Also closer to here." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt her pulse quicken again, but kept her expression composed. "You're establishing your own ranch," Cedar Wolf nodded. "With some of the settlement money. I have experience with horses. Before the Troubles, my family raised some of the finest in the territory. I thought perhaps I might begin again. That sounds like a worthy endeavor," Eleanor said carefully, unsure where he was leading. "In our traditions," Cedar Wolf continued, "when a man establishes himself, he may then honorably seek a companion to share his life." His dark eyes met hers. Directly, "I don't speak of this now to press you for an answer, but to let you know that my path has room for two, should you ever wish to walk it with me." The declaration took Eleanor's breath away. Not because it was entirely unexpected. There had been something growing between them since that first meeting in Deadwood, but because of the dignity and respect with which he presented it. Not a demand, not even a formal proposal, but an opening of possibility. "Among your people," she asked softly, "what happens when a woman receives such an indication of interest?" A smile touched the corners of Cedar Wolf's mouth. "She considers it for as long as she wishes. She consults her heart and her family, and when she is ready, whether that is days or months or seasons later, she gives her answer. And if her answer is yes, then there would be proper courtship. Her family would meet with his, gifts would be exchanged, preparations made. And if her family objects—" Cedar Wolf's expression grew more serious. "In the old days, sometimes couples would simply leave together if families couldn't agree. But I would not ask that of you, Eleanor Blackwood. Your father has suffered enough loss." Eleanor was touched by his consideration. "What of your family? Would they object to someone like me?" "My parents walk in the spirit world now," Cedar Wolf said. "But my uncle, who raised me after their passing, is a wise man who judges people by their actions, not their ancestry. He knows what you did for my sister's memory. That is enough for him." A cold wind gusted around them, carrying the promise of more snow. Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. "This is all very unexpected," she admitted. "As I said, I don't seek an answer today, only to plant a seed that might grow in time." Cedar Wolf mounted his horse with fluid grace. Looking down at her, he added, "Consider the council position first. That decision need not have anything to do with me or my hopes." Eleanor nodded, appreciating his understanding that her independence mattered. "I will, and I'll send word to Agent Peterson by the end of the month." Cedar Wolf gathered his reins. "Until we meet again, Eleanor Blackwood." "Until then, Cedar Wolf," she replied, watching as he rode away, his straight figure gradually disappearing into the winter landscape. Thomas was waiting on the porch when she returned to the house. "Everything all right?" he asked, studying her face. "Yes," Eleanor said. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "Cedar Wolf has been granted land near Bear Creek. He's starting a horse ranch." Thomas nodded slowly. "Good country out that way, strong water rights. He also—" Eleanor paused, unsure how to express what had passed between them. "He indicated that he might have interest in courtship at some point in the future." She watched, her father carefully, prepared for anger or resistance. Thomas looked out across the snow-covered ranch for a long moment before responding. "Your mother would have liked him," he said finally. "She always said character mattered more than where a person came from." Eleanor blinked back sudden tears. "You're not opposed?" Thomas turned to her, his weathered face softening. 3 months ago, I was willing to sell you to a monster to save this land. I have no right to dictate your heart now." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Besides, any man who would go to the lengths he did to protect his sister's memory would do no less for his wife." The simple statement, so at odds with the prejudices she'd expected, filled Eleanor with warmth despite the winter chill. "I haven't given him an answer," she said. "I'm not sure what it will be." "Time will tell," Thomas replied. "Just know that whatever you decide, you have my support." Inside the house, Eleanor moved to her mother's writing desk by the window, a place she'd always found conducive to clear thinking. From the drawer, she removed a sheet of paper and dipped a pen in ink. After a moment's consideration, she began to write. "Dear Agent Peterson, I'm writing to express my interest in the advisory council position recommended by Cedar Wolf." The words flowed easily as she outlined her unique perspective as someone who bridged 2 worlds, the traditional ranching culture she'd grown up in and the new understanding she'd gained through recent events. She wrote of her hope that the bitter conflicts of the past might give way to cooperation, that the next generation might inherit a territory where all people were treated with justice and dignity. As she wrote, Eleanor felt a sense of purpose. Unlike anything she'd known before, the Blackwood Ranch would always be her heritage, but perhaps her future held something broader, a chance to help shape the territory's path forward, to be part of healing wounds that had festered for too long. Outside the window, snow began to fall again, soft flakes dancing on the winter wind. Eleanor paused in her writing, watching them settle on the silent landscape, covering the old earth with new possibilities. In the distance, though he was no longer visible, she knew Cedar Wolf was riding toward his own land, perhaps harboring similar thoughts of what might come with the changing seasons. Spring would arrive eventually, bringing growth and renewal. Seeds planted now, whether of policy or of deeper personal connection, would have their chance to flourish. Eleanor smiled to herself as she returned to her letter. The forced auction that had nearly claimed her future had instead opened doorways she'd never imagined existed. The territory was changing, she was changing, and in that transformation lay hope, not just for herself but for all who called this challenging, beautiful land their home. Spring arrived in the Dakota Territory with its customary drama, melting snow, swelling streams into raging torrents, sudden warm days followed by freezing nights, and eventually the first tentative green shoots pushing through the sodden earth. Eleanor Blackwood had always loved this season of renewal, but this year it held special significance. 2 months had passed since she'd accepted the position on Agent Peterson's advisory council. In that time, she'd attended 3 meetings, 2 at the reservation and 1 in Rapid City, and had begun to understand the enormous complexity of the issues facing both settlers and the Lakota people. Water rights, hunting territories, education for Lakota children, protection from unscrupulous traders, all required careful navigation of competing interests and deep-seated prejudices. Yet Eleanor found the work unexpectedly fulfilling. Her natural ability to see multiple perspectives, combined with the respect she'd earned from both communities during the Davidson affair, allowed her to bridge divides that had previously seemed insurmountable. "You have a gift for this, Agent," Peterson had told her after the most recent meeting, where Eleanor had helped negotiate a compromise on hunting rights that satisfied both Lakota elders and local ranchers. You speak plainly but with respect, and people listen. Now, as Eleanor rode along the northern boundary of Blackwood Ranch, she reflected on how much had changed in half a year. The land itself looked different, not just with the season, but through her eyes. Where once she had seen only the ranch's borders, she now recognized ancient Lakota trails and traditional gathering places that had existed long before the first settler stakes were driven. Her horse, a spirited chestnut mare named Ember, pricked, her ears forward suddenly. Eleanor followed her gaze to see a rider approaching along Bear Creek, Cedar Wolf, mounted on his black and white paint stallion. They had seen each other regularly at council meetings, but always in formal settings. Surrounded by others, this was their first private encounter since his visit to the ranch in winter. Eleanor felt a flutter of anticipation as she guided Ember toward him. "Eleanor Blackwood," Cedar Wolf greeted her with the hint of a smile. "You ride far from home. Today?" "Not so far," she replied. "We're still on Blackwood land, though near the border." Cedar Wolf nodded, looking around appreciatively. "Good grazing here. Your cattle thrive." "They do." "How goes your horse ranch? I heard you brought in some new stock?" Pride flickered across his usually stoic features. "Yes. 3 mares from the south, Spanish bloodlines, strong and intelligent, and a stallion traded from the Crow, fast as wind on the prairie." "I'd like to see them sometime," Eleanor said, then added more formally, "It would be valuable for the council to understand your breeding program. If successful, it could provide a model for other Lakota horse ventures." Cedar Wolf's eyes brightened with amusement at her diplomatic framing. "Of course. The council's interest is most welcome." They rode side by side along the creek, talking of council matters, ranch developments, and the territorial news. Eleanor found herself relaxing in his company in a way she rarely did with others. Cedar Wolf listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, his words carried weight and insight. "The northern boundary of your ranch," he said after a contemplative silence. "It follows this creek, does it not?" Eleanor nodded. "All the way to the ridgeline, then east along the old wagon trail. My land begins just beyond," Cedar Wolf noted. "We are neighbors of a sort, though separated by the ridge." "Is that why you chose that particular plot?" Eleanor asked, curiosity overcoming propriety. Cedar Wolf considered her question. "Partly," he admitted. "The land itself is excellent. Good. Water-sheltered valleys, direct access to summer grazing grounds, but yes, its proximity to Blackwood Ranch was a consideration." The simple acknowledgement stirred something in Eleanor's chest. They rode on in companionable silence until reaching a high point overlooking both properties. Blackwood Ranch spreading south and east, Cedar Wolf's new holding to the north and west. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Eleanor said, gazing across the landscape painted in spring colors. "Yes," Cedar Wolf agreed, though when she turned she found him looking at her rather than the view. Heat rose to Eleanor's cheeks, but she didn't look away. For months, their interactions had been carefully circumscribed by protocol and public settings. Now, alone under the vast Dakota sky, something shifted between them. "I've been thinking about what you said. In winter," Eleanor said, finding courage, "in the open air and distance from prying eyes." And his voice was steady, but she noticed his hand tighten slightly on the reins. "My answer is not no," Eleanor said carefully, "but there is much to consider before it can be yes." Cedar Wolf nodded, understanding the nuance of her response. "What considerations trouble you most?" Eleanor appreciated his directness. "How would such a union work? Where would we live? Would I be expected to abandon my heritage and adopt Lakota ways entirely? Would you be expected to forsake yours and live as a white settler?" These were questions that had kept her awake on many nights. Though attitudes were slowly changing, marriages between Lakota and settlers remained rare and often met with hostility from both communities. Important questions, Cedar Wolf acknowledged. I have thought of them as well. He gestured toward the horizon. Perhaps the answer lies not in choosing one world over the other, but in creating something new, a place where both can exist together. Is that possible? Eleanor asked. It will not be easy, Cedar Wolf admitted. There will be resistance from both sides, but consider what we have already accomplished through the Council. 5 years ago, would anyone have imagined Lakota elders and territorial officials sitting at the same table, reaching agreements that benefit both peoples? Eleanor smiled at his optimism, unexpected from someone who had experienced so much hardship and loss. You make a compelling argument, Cedar Wolf. There is something else you should know, he added, his expression growing more serious. In 3 weeks, I journey to Washington with Agent Peterson and 2 elders. We will speak before congressional committees about conditions here and the need for treaty enforcement. Washington? Eleanor was impressed. That's a significant opportunity and a significant risk, Cedar Wolf replied. Not all in the capital wish to hear Lakota voices. Some would prefer we remain silent or disappear entirely. Concern furrowed Eleanor's brow. How long will you be gone? At least 2 months, perhaps longer. Cedar Wolf's eyes held hers. I would not leave without telling you, and without asking. If you might consider writing to me while I am away. The request, so simple yet so meaningful, touched Eleanor deeply. Letter writing was an intimate connection, a sharing of thoughts and feelings that transcended physical distance. I would be honored to correspond with you, she said softly. Something profound passed between them in that moment, not quite a commitment, but an acknowledgement of possibility, of doors opening rather than closing. I should return to the ranch, Eleanor said finally. Father and Jackson are moving the herd to summer pasture today, and I promised to help with the accounts. Cedar Wolf nodded. And I have fences to mend before sundown. He hesitated, then added, Perhaps you could visit my ranch before I leave for Washington to see the horses, as you mentioned, for the council's interest, of course. Eleanor smiled at his playful echo of her earlier diplomatic phrasing. For the council's interest, certainly, and perhaps for my own as well. They parted at the creek junction, each riding toward their respective responsibilities, yet Eleanor felt the invisible thread connecting them, stretching rather than breaking with the distance. When she arrived back at the ranch house, she found her father at the kitchen table, poring over ledgers with a furrowed brow. How's it looking? She asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee from the pot Martha kept perpetually warm on the stove. Thomas sighed, removing his reading spectacles. Better than last year, not as good as I'd hoped. The spring calving went well, but feed costs keep rising. Eleanor nodded, understanding his concern. Though the immediate financial crisis had passed, ranching remained a precarious business, vulnerable to weather, market fluctuations, and disease. We might consider diversifying, she suggested, taking the seat opposite him. Perhaps breeding. A few horses alongside the cattle. There's increasing demand for quality mounts. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Horses, you say? Wouldn't have anything to do with our Lakota neighbor's new venture, would it? Eleanor felt her cheeks warm. It's good business sense, she said firmly. But yes, I did encounter a cedar wolf today. He's established his breeding stock and has some impressive animals. Thomas said non-committally, though his eyes held a knowing glint. Speaking of our neighbor, Jackson mentioned seeing smoke signals from the reservation this morning. Anything we should be concerned about? It's not a war party, if that's what you're asking, Eleanor replied with a touch of asperity. The tribal council is calling a gathering to prepare for the Washington delegation. Cedar Wolf will be going with Agent Peterson. Thomas looked surprised. To Washington? That's significant. Yes, Eleanor agreed. It could mean real progress. If Congress actually listens. Big if, Thomas murmured. He studied his daughter's face for a moment. You care for him, don't you? And not just as a council colleague. The direct question caught Eleanor off guard. Ordinarily, such personal matters weren't discussed so openly, especially between father and daughter. But their relationship had evolved beyond such constraints. "I do," she admitted, "though what that might mean for the future remains uncertain." Thomas nodded slowly. "Life offers few certainties, Eleanor. Your mother taught me that. We plan, we hope, but in the end we must simply make the best choices we can with what we know at the time. And if the choice is difficult, if it means challenging convention and risking disapproval," Thomas's weathered face softened, "then you must weigh what matters most, the opinions of others, or the truth in your own heart." Coming from the man who had once been so constrained by social expectations, so concerned with appearances and position, these words carried particular weight. "Cedar Wolf asked if I might write to him while he's in Washington," Eleanor said. "And will you?" "Yes," she replied without hesitation. "I believe I will." Thomas smiled slightly. "Good. Correspondence is an excellent way to truly know a person's mind." He returned to his ledgers, then added casually, "You might invite him to Sunday dinner before he leaves. I'd like to hear more about this horse breeding operation. For business reasons, of course." Eleanor suppressed a smile at her father's transparent attempt at matchmaking. "Of course, for business reasons." The following weeks passed in a flurry of activity. Spring roundup demanded all hands on the ranch, while council matters required Eleanor's attention 2 days each week. She visited Cedar Wolf's nascent horse ranch as promised, genuinely impressed by the quality of his stock and the careful planning evident in his operation. The Sunday dinner her father had suggested expanded to include Agent Peterson, providing a diplomatic cover for what might otherwise have raised eyebrows in the community. Martha outdid herself with the meal, and the conversation flowed easily from territorial politics to agricultural techniques to shared stories of frontier life. Eleanor observed Cedar Wolf throughout the evening, noting how confidently he navigated the white settler customs that differed from his own traditions. He used the proper silverware, engaged Thomas in knowledgeable discussion of cattle bloodlines, and treated Martha with respectful courtesy that clearly won the housekeeper's approval. "He adapts well," Peterson commented quietly to Eleanor as they stood on the porch after dinner, watching Cedar Wolf and Thomas examine a new saddle in the yard. "Few men can bridge cultures as he does." "It can't be easy," Eleanor replied. "Never. Fully belonging in either world." Peterson, a thoughtful New Englander with surprisingly progressive views, studied her face. "Perhaps the future lies not in maintaining separate worlds, Miss Blackwood, but in creating new ones, where diverse traditions can coexist." The echo of Cedar Wolf's earlier sentiment struck Eleanor forcefully. "That's an admirable vision, Agent Peterson. But how practical is it in our current climate? Change begins with individuals brave enough to imagine something different," Peterson said. "The delegation to Washington represents one such effort. Your work on the council is another." He paused meaningfully. "And personal connections across traditional boundaries may ultimately prove the most powerful catalyst of all." Before Eleanor could respond to this pointed observation, Cedar Wolf and Thomas rejoined them, and the conversation shifted to the upcoming journey east. The day of departure arrived with unseasonable warmth. Eleanor rode to the reservation to bid farewell to the Washington delegation. A sizable crowd had gathered, Lakota families sending off their representatives with songs and prayers, a few progressive settlers offering support, Agent Peterson's staff making final preparations. Cedar Wolf stood somewhat apart, dressed in a striking combination of traditional and Western attire that Eleanor suspected was carefully calculated to make an impression in Washington while honoring his heritage. When he saw her approach, he moved to help her dismount, his hands strong and sure at her waist. "I brought you something," Eleanor said when her feet were on the ground. From her saddlebag she withdrew a small leather-bound journal. "For your observations during the journey, I thought you might want to record your impressions of the eastern cities." Cedar Wolf accepted the gift with evident appreciation. "Thank you. I will fill it with words for you to read upon my return, and I'll have letters waiting for you," Eleanor promised. "Agent Peterson has provided an address where I can send them." Around them, final preparations were underway. The delegation would ride to Rapid City, then take the train east, a journey of many days that would carry Cedar Wolf farther from his homeland than he had ever traveled. "There is something I must ask before I go," Cedar Wolf said, his voice low enough that only Eleanor could hear. "Something I need to know." Eleanor's heart quickened. "What is it?" "When I return, if circumstances allow, would you consider a formal courtship? Not a secret understanding, but an open declaration of intention with all that entails." The directness of the question took Eleanor's breath away. This was no vague suggestion of future possibility, but a clear request for commitment, one that would have profound implications for them both. "That would cause quite a stir in the territory," she said, "not as a refusal, but as an acknowledgement of reality." "Yes," Cedar Wolf agreed, "but perhaps such a stir is needed. The reservation agent and a rancher's daughter working together on... The council has already challenged expectations. This would be another step toward the new world we have spoken of." Eleanor thought of all they had each risked and sacrificed to reach this point. Cedar Wolf's long quest for justice, her own confrontation with Davidson, their shared vision of a more just territory. A formal courtship would face opposition, certainly, but hadn't they already proven themselves capable of overcoming seemingly impossible obstacles? "Yes," she said finally, her voice steady despite the momentous nature of her answer. "When you return, I will consider that." "More than consider it, I would welcome it." The joy that transformed Cedar Wolf's normally stoic features was like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. He took her hand, pressing it briefly between both of his, the most intimate gesture possible under the watchful eyes of the gathering. Then, "I have something to return for, beyond the council's work," he said softly. "Mr. Cedar, we must depart now to reach Rapid City by nightfall." Agent Peterson's voice broke the moment. Cedar Wolf nodded in acknowledgement, but kept his eyes on Eleanor. "I will write as soon as we reach Washington." "Be careful," Eleanor said. "Not everyone will welcome your message there." "I have faced greater dangers for lesser causes," he reminded her with a slight smile. "And now I have a greater reason than ever to return safely." Their farewell was necessarily brief and formal, observed as it was by many curious eyes. Yet, as Eleanor watched the delegation ride away, Cedar Wolf's straight figure gradually diminishing with distance, she felt not the pain of separation, but the anticipation of new beginnings. The northern plains stretched vast and open before them, all a landscape that had witnessed centuries of conflict and cooperation, hardship and hope. Whatever the future held, Eleanor knew with sudden clarity that she would face it alongside this remarkable man who had fought not just to save her from auction, but to forge a path toward a more just world for all. Summer blazed across the Dakota Territory, turning the lush spring grasses to gold. At Blackwood Ranch, the days stretched long and full as Eleanor divided her time between ranch duties, council responsibilities, and the growing stack of letters exchanged with Cedar Wolf. His missives from Washington arrived irregularly, sometimes 2 in a week, then nothing for a fortnight, each one providing glimpses into a world Eleanor could scarcely imagine. He wrote of marble buildings that dwarfed the largest structures in Deadwood, of rooms filled with men arguing over the fate of people they had never met, of streets teeming with more humans than buffalo had ever roamed the plains. These eastern, Men speak of justice and civilization, he wrote in one letter that Eleanor had read so many times the paper was wearing thin. Yet they know nothing of the land they claim to govern. I stood before the Congressional Committee yesterday and described how the mining operations violate our treaties. Some listened with interest, others with impatience, but most with the blank expressions of men who have already decided what they will believe, regardless of evidence. Despite the frustrations, Cedar Wolf's mission appeared to be making progress. Agent Peterson wrote separately to the council that several influential senators had been moved by the delegation's testimony, particularly the carefully documented evidence of treaty violations that Eleanor had helped compile. Eleanor's replies to Cedar Wolf balanced political updates from the territory with more personal reflections. She described the council's work, the changing dynamics between settlers and Lakota communities, and her own growing conviction that their vision of coexistence was not merely idealistic, but necessary for the territory's future. She also wrote of simpler things: the bluebird that had built a nest outside her window, the new foal born to one of her father's mares, the summer thunderstorms that brought both welcome rain and terrifying lightning to the open prairie. These details of prairie life seemed to sustain Cedar Wolf amid the artificial confines of Washington. Your words carry the scent of sage and sweet grass, he wrote. They remind me of what is real and true when I am surrounded by so much that feels false. As July turned to August, with no clear indication of when the delegation might return, Eleanor found herself increasingly restless. The uncertainty was difficult, not just of when Cedar Wolf would come back, but of what would follow. They had agreed to a formal courtship, but the practical realities of such an unprecedented step remained daunting. It was Martha who finally addressed the unspoken tension one evening as Eleanor sat at her desk, struggling to compose her latest letter. "You're fretting yourself thin as spring ice," the housekeeper observed, setting a cup of tea beside Eleanor's writing paper. "Won't do him any good to come home and find you've worried yourself sick." Eleanor smiled ruefully. "Is it that obvious?" These old eyes, clear as creek water. Martha sat in the chair opposite, an unusual liberty that spoke to their deepening friendship. "You're wondering how it will work, aren't you? You and him from such different worlds." "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "In Washington he's a respected delegate. Here, many still see only his heritage, not his character or accomplishments." Martha nodded sagely. "Folks fear what they don't understand. Always have, but fear can be overcome with time and example." She picked up a half-finished piece of beadwork that Eleanor had been learning from one of the Lakota women on the council. "You're already building bridges, Miss Eleanor. Some may be ready to cross them sooner than you think." This encouraging perspective was unexpectedly reinforced the following Sunday when Eleanor accompanied her father to services in Clearwater, the nearest town. Afterward, as the congregation mingled outside the small wooden church, several people approached her with questions about the council's work, not with suspicion or hostility as had been common initially, but with genuine interest. "Heard you. Folks negotiated that new trade agreement with the reservation," said Abigail Wilson, wife of the general store owner. "Frank says it's good business. Those Lakota blankets are selling faster than he can stock them. And my boy says that the Lakota hunter, Red Hawk, taught his class how to track animals last week at school," added Sarah Mitchell, the schoolteacher's wife. "First time he's been excited about learning since winter." Such comments would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. Eleanor realized that while the challenges remained substantial, progress was indeed occurring in small but significant ways throughout the community. Thomas noticed it too. "People are starting to see the benefits of cooperation," he observed as they rode back to the ranch. "Self-interest is a powerful motivator." "Is that cynical or practical?" Eleanor asked with a smile. "Both, I expect," Thomas replied. "Most folks Won't change their minds for abstract principles, but show them a concrete advantage, better trade, new skills, safer borders, and they'll reconsider their positions quickly enough. Eleanor reflected on her father's insight as they rode. Perhaps the path forward wasn't about changing hearts all at once, but building enough common ground that the old prejudices gradually lost their power. The approaching harvest brought a welcome distraction from Eleanor's uncertain future. The ranch's hayfields needed cutting, cattle had to be prepared for fall sales, and garden bounty required preserving for the winter ahead. These timeless rhythms of ranch life kept her hands busy, while her mind often wandered eastward. It was during this busy season, as September painted the cottonwoods along Bear Creek with golden light, that the territorial mail carrier delivered a telegram rather than the expected letter. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she opened the yellow paper. Returning, stop arrive. Rapid City, September 15th. Stop much to tell. Stop Cedar relief washed through her, followed by a flutter of anticipation. September 15th, just 4 days away. After nearly 4 months of separation, Cedar Wolf was coming home. The news energized the entire household. Thomas instructed Jackson to ensure the ranch was in perfect order for visitors we might be expecting. Martha embarked on a flurry of cleaning and baking. Eleanor found herself sorting through her wardrobe with uncharacteristic concern for appearances. When the day finally arrived, Eleanor rode to Rapid City alone, despite her father's offer of company. Some moments, she had decided, belonged solely to those directly involved. The frontier town buzzed with its usual activity: freight wagons unloading supplies, miners spending their earnings, farm families purchasing necessities for the coming winter. Eleanor tethered Ember outside the territorial office, where Agent Peterson had indicated the delegation would first report upon their return. She had barely settled on a nearby bench when the unmistakable sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. To the eastern road, 4 riders approached, Agent Peterson's tall figure easily recognizable, followed by the 2 Lakota elders, Whitefeather and Running Bear. And there, riding slightly apart as was his habit, came Cedar Wolf. Eleanor's breath caught. Something about him had changed, not in physical appearance, though his clothes were more formal than she remembered, but in his bearing. He sat straighter, his gaze more commanding, like a man who had faced powerful adversaries and held his ground. She stood as the riders dismounted before the territorial office. Cedar Wolf saw her immediately, his normally stoic expression warming visibly. While Peterson and the elders were greeted by waiting officials, Cedar Wolf moved directly to where Eleanor stood. "Eleanor Blackwood," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet strength she remembered. "Cedar Wolf," she replied, suddenly conscious of the public setting and the curious eyes watching their reunion. "Welcome home." "It is good to return," he said simply. Then, with a glance at their observers, he added more formally, "I have much to report to the council about our mission." "Yes, of course," Eleanor responded, understanding his discretion. "The council is eager to hear of your progress." A ghost of a smile touched his lips at this diplomatic exchange. "Perhaps we might discuss preliminary findings while I escort you home. If you have no other commitments in town?" "None at all," Eleanor assured him. "I came specifically to welcome the delegation." As they collected their horses and rode out of Rapid City, the formal facade gradually gave way to more natural conversation. Cedar Wolf described the delegation's experiences, the grueling journey by train, the overwhelming scale of eastern cities, the complex dance of politics they had navigated in Washington. "We achieved more than I dared hope," he said, as they followed the winding trail toward Blackwood Ranch. "Several senators have committed to enforcing existing treaty provisions, and the Interior Department has approved funding for a formal investigation of illegal mining operations." "That's remarkable," Eleanor said. Agent Peterson's letters mentioned progress, but not concrete outcomes like these. The victory is not complete, Cedar Wolf cautioned. There are still powerful interests working against us, but we have gained allies, and more importantly, we have demonstrated that the Lakota can effectively advocate within the American political system. Eleanor heard the pride in his voice, not personal vanity, but legitimate satisfaction in advancing his people's cause. "You've done important work," she said. "Your sister would be proud." At the mention of Morning Star, Cedar Wolf's expression softened. "Yes, I believe she would. Justice for her was my first purpose, but the journey has revealed a broader path." They rode in companionable silence for a time. The vast Dakota landscape spread before them, familiar yet somehow new in the light of their reunion. Eleanor sensed Cedar Wolf had more to say beyond the political accomplishments of the delegation. "Something changed for you in Washington," she observed. "Something beyond the official mission." Cedar Wolf glanced at her with appreciation for her perception. "Yes, I discovered that I could walk in the white man's world without losing myself, that I could speak their language, political as well as verbal, while remaining true to my heritage." He paused reflectively. "It was a revelation that has implications beyond politics." Eleanor understood his meaning immediately. His experience paralleled her own journey of discovering she could respect and learn from Lakota traditions without abandoning her own cultural foundations. "We're both finding that the boundaries between our worlds are more permeable than we were taught to believe," she said. Cedar Wolf nodded. "Exactly so." He guided his horse closer to hers as the trail narrowed through a grove of cottonwoods. "Which brings me to matters I wish to discuss away from public eyes." Eleanor's pulse quickened. "The courtship we spoke of before you left?" "Yes," Cedar Wolf confirmed. "My time in Washington confirmed what I already believed, that the future lies not in defending rigid divisions between our peoples, but in finding ways to honor both traditions while creating something new." "I've come to the same conclusion," Eleanor said. "Through the council work, I've seen how much stronger we are when we combine our knowledge and perspectives rather than setting them against each other." Cedar Wolf's expression grew more serious. "But I must be honest about the challenges. A formal courtship between us will face opposition from both communities. There will be those who see it as a betrayal of tradition, or worse." "I'm well aware," Eleanor replied steadily. "Martha and my father have been preparing me for the gossip and criticism we're likely to face." "And you are still willing to proceed?" Eleanor met his gaze directly. "More than willing. These past months have clarified much for me. The letters we exchanged, the work we've each done. They've shown me that what we share transcends the artificial boundaries others would impose." Relief and joy transformed Cedar Wolf's features. From inside his coat, he withdrew a small bundle, wrapped in soft deerskin. "Then I offer this, as is traditional among my people, when a man declares his intentions." Eleanor accepted the bundle, carefully unwrapping it to reveal an exquisite necklace of polished blue stones, intricate beadwork, and a single eagle feather bound in silver. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "The stones are from the sacred Black Hills," Cedar Wolf explained. "The beadwork tells the story of two rivers that begin apart but join to form something stronger. And the eagle feather represents vision, seeing beyond what is to what might be." The symbolic meaning touched Eleanor deeply. "I accept your gift and all it represents," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion welling within her. Cedar Wolf's shoulders relaxed slightly, as if he had released a long-held tension. "There is one more thing," he said, "a more practical matter." "What is it?" "I have purchased additional land," he said. "The Peterson property that lies between my holdings and the northern boundary of Blackwood Ranch." Eleanor looked at him in surprise. "That's considerable acreage. When did this happen? The final agreements were signed yesterday upon our return, Cedar Wolf explained. Agent Peterson helped arrange it while we were in Washington. But why that particular property? Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. It connects our lands, Cedar Wolf said simply. And it contains something unique, the ridge where we spoke before I left, with views of both properties. Understanding dawned. You're thinking of the future. A place that belongs to neither tradition exclusively, but bridges both. Cedar Wolf nodded. A place where we might build something new, if you were agreeable. The implication was clear, not just courtship, but a vision of their life together. Eleanor was moved by the thoughtfulness behind his action, the way he had created a physical manifestation of their shared philosophy. "Show me," she said. "I'd like to see this land that connects us." They turned their horses toward the ridge, following a game trail that wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, beginning to turn with the season. As they climbed, the valley opened below them, revealing Blackwood Ranch to the south, Cedar Wolf's horse farm to the north, and between them, the newly purchased land with its mix of meadows, woods, and a small lake fed by Bear Creek. At the highest point, where the ridge flattened into a natural plateau, they dismounted. The view was spectacular. Mountains in the distance, rolling prairie stretching toward the horizon, the winding silver thread of the creek below. "Here, Cedar," Wolf said, indicating the plateau. "This is where I envision a home. Not a traditional Lakota dwelling, not a settler's ranch house, but something that honors both heritages while meeting the needs of the future." Eleanor walked the space, feeling the solid ground beneath her boots, the clean wind on her face. She could see it too, a home with elements from both cultures, large enough for family gatherings that would include both Lakota and settler relatives, positioned to embrace rather than divide the landscape. "Yes," she said simply, "this is the place." Cedar Wolf moved to stand beside her, close but not touching, respecting the public nature of their courtship despite the private setting. "There is much work ahead, building not just a home, but understanding in our communities. It will require patience and perseverance from us both." "Qualities we've demonstrated already, I think," Eleanor replied with a smile. Indeed, Cedar Wolf's dark eyes held hers. "The journey that began with such darkness, my sister's loss, your father's desperation, has led to unexpected light," Eleanor thought of all the improbable turns that had brought them to this moment. Davidson's crimes, the fateful poker game, her father's redemption, the council's formation, the Washington delegation. A path neither of them could have foreseen, yet one that now seemed meant to be. "From auction block to building block," she said softly. "What started as the worst moment of my life has become the foundation for something beautiful." As the September sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Eleanor and Cedar Wolf stood side by side on the ridge that would become their home, gazing out at the land that had shaped them both. Two people from worlds that had long been in conflict, now united in purpose and affection, creating a bridge where others saw only boundaries. The Dakota wind swept across the plateau, carrying the scent of pine and prairie grass, whispering of possibilities that transcended the pain of the past. Eleanor felt it like a blessing on her face, a promise of renewal. "Shall we tell the others?" Cedar Wolf asked, gesturing toward Blackwood Ranch, where smoke rose from the chimney in anticipation of their return. "Yes," Eleanor replied, her heart full. "It's time to begin the next chapter of our story." They mounted their horses and rode down from the ridge together, no longer a rancher's daughter and a Lakota warrior following separate paths, but partners, forging a single trail into a future limited only by the scope of their shared vision and the depth of their courage to pursue it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.